Good afternoon, ninth grade students. Today we have a mystery reader for you. I am pleased to introduce to you John Hosmer, who is from Boston, Massachusetts, and is here visiting North Carolina, and he is a data science consultant, and I am so excited. He is going to just pick up where I left off yesterday. So please welcome John Hosmer.
All right. On June 21st, 3 ropes full of climbers picked their way up a steep rock face and stood on a narrow shelf of snow and loose rock. Underfoot was the nearly level rock platform of Camp 4, built by Houston's expedition the year before. The men dropped their 50-pound loads and stared up at a nearly vertical mass of dark granite, rising 150 to 400 feet high. Until now, K2 had given them a mix of snow, fields, and rock outcroppings. Here was the raw mountain, a castle wall separating the lower slopes from the lonely, wind-battered upper reaches of the earth. The gate in the wall was a ragged, snow-filled crack carved vertically into the rock, house's chimney. Weissner and the others congratulated themselves. They stood at 21,500 feet, almost a mile above base camp. The summit stood nearly 7,000 feet above them, but they were finally making progress. For Durrance, it hadn't been easy. His feet were freezing in his flimsy boots, and the climb from below had been harrowing. The lead climbers had tried to step carefully, but they couldn't help dislodging rocks. Dozens of feet down the slope, the rest of the team felt like they had stepped onto a battlefield. The bombs fell without much warning, a faint shout above the roar of the wind, maybe the clatter of the stone on stone. To Durrance, it seemed like gambling. Clinging to the side of the mountain, there was little he could do to dodge the falling rocks. If one of them arrived with just the right speed and trajectory, it wouldn't matter how carefully he'd roped up, how expertly he chose his footholds. Nothing but luck stood between him and certain death. Now Durrance had survived the gauntlet. But as soon as he set down his load at Camp 4, he turned around to retrace his steps. His feet were on the verge of frostbite, and climbers were needed below to keep the chain of supplies moving up the mountain. He left with a team of Sherpas for the relative luxury of Camp 2. There, he would meet up with Cromwell and start hauling loads back up to Camp 4 while Weissner pressed ahead. Meanwhile, the advance party settled in near the base of House's chimney. By dark, 3 tents stood on Charlie Houston's meager platform. Weissner, Wolf, and Sheldon climbed into one. Kikuli, Say Tendrup, and Pasang Kitar bunked in another. The third sheltered their supplies. They had just drifted off to sleep when the most terrifying storm Fritz Weissner had ever seen shrieked in from the northwest and began to batter the slopes of K2. A couple of days into the storm, George Sheldon felt like he was losing his mind. He was trapped with Weissner and Wolf in a tent barely big enough for the 3 of them. Standing was impossible. To sit upright at the same time, all 3 men had to crowd into the center of the tent. This was their prison. They left the shelter of the flimsy canvas only when they had no other choice, for bathroom breaks or to grab food and fuel from the supply tent. As soon as they stepped outside, 80-per-mile-hour gusts threatened to launch them off the mountainside into Tibet. The air churned with particles of snow and ice. From the sky or the ground, it was impossible to tell. You could barely see your hand at the edge of an outstretched arm. The tents were hardly any comfort. The men huddled inside their sleeping bags, wrapped in several pairs of long underwear, windsuits, boots, and mittens, but the cold bit through every layer they had. The tent walls snapped and cracked under the force of the wind. The noise was deafening, and it never seemed to stop. Did they really think that a few yards of canvas could protect them from the raw power of the storm? All it would take was one tiny rip for the wind to tear their tent to shreds. Sheldon was terrified. He had struggled to make it this high on the mountain. Like Wolf, he was clumsy on the slopes. He looked to Weissner for advice and comfort, and Weissner, the great Fritz Weissner, honestly seemed scared. In 27 years of climbing, he said, he had never seen a storm like this. That was enough to send shivers of panic through George Sheldon's nervous system. That, and the howling wind, and the snapping of the tent, and sleepless nights he spent trying to massage feeling back into his frozen toes. He knew it was insane, but he had a terrible urge to rip open the door of the tent and run. Forget about his frost-nipped feet, Forget about the gale, forget about the fact that you couldn't see a thing outside. He just wanted to get off the mountain. 2,000 feet below, in Camp 2, Durrance and Cromwell wanted the same thing. For nearly a week, they had barely left their tents. Over the screaming of the wind, they read to each other. Mostly, they fantasized about leaving K2 behind. They planned detours for the trip home, savoring the options the way starving people dream of food. There would be a week of drinking in Senegal, sightseeing in India, a little trekking for Durrance in the Dolomite Mountains of Italy. Mountaineers have a word for it when they desire to climb begins to disappear. They call it crumping. It takes more than skill and fitness to scale the highest mountains on Earth. Climbers need something else to get them past frozen feet and fingers, headaches, nausea, sleepless nights, and days spent fighting 50 per mile winds. Maybe it's willpower, or the single-minded desire to stand on the summit. Maybe it's an addiction to the adrenaline that surges through the body when a single bad step could send you plummeting to your death. Whatever that quality is, it can vanish at any time. And that is exactly what was happening to George Sheldon, Jack Durrance, and Tony Cromwell. Halfway up the second highest mountain on Earth, they just wanted to go home. On June 29th, the 13 climbers camped along K2's Aberuzzi Ridge woke to an unfamiliar feeling. The mountain was silent for the first time in 8 days. At Camp 4, Weissner and Wolf emerged from their tents filled with energy. Now, Weissner felt, the mountain could be climbed. He and Wolf would stay high. With the help of Basan Kukuli, the most experienced climber in the Himalaya, they would force their way up the mountain. Finally, K2 would be there. But for George Sheldon, the end of the storm could not have come too soon. He was desperate to get down the mountain. He stuffed his frozen feet into his boots and roped up with several of the Sherpas to descend. As they disappeared over the lip of the overhang, Weissner stood at the top, yelling encouragement down the slope. To reach the summit, he needed help from below. He needed high camp stocked food and sleeping bags. Sheldon would be fine, he thought, after a few days of recovery. Then he could rejoin them, hauling supplies up the mountain. The last thing on Sheldon's mind as he climbed down towards Camp 2, my attitude about K2, he had written in his diary, is to get the hell out of here. Chapter 7, Puppet Master. Fritz Weissner could taste the summit. On the morning of July 1st, he emerged at the top of House's chimney, pounded a piton in, and ran ropes 80 feet down to Wolf, Kukuli, and Tendrup. Soon they all stood at the top of the giant rock face, 22,000 feet above sea level. Here, the wind blew harder and the slopes grew more exposed. The mountain felt wilder, even less like a place where humans belonged. And that was just as it should be. Both Weissner and Wolf were feeling good as they set up at Camp 5. Wolf's feet had suffered during their week-long imprisonment, but he was getting used to the altitude. Now that the storm had blown over, Weissner figured Cromwell, Durrance, and Sherpas are pushing supplies up the mountain. With fully stocked camps, they would be in a great position to summit in the next week or two. Later that day, 2 more Sherpas arrived with a note from below. Durrance had news. Camp 2 had survived the storm. Sheldon had made it down from Camp 4, weak but safe, and best of all, Durrance's new boots had arrived with a bag full of mail. They were still hauling loads from Camp 1 to Camp 2, Durrance wrote. Once they were done, they would start carrying up to 4, but he wanted to make sure that no one would be climbing above them and launch a bombardment of loose rocks onto their heads. Tony and I will remain in 2 until further orders from you, he wrote. Weissner was furious. Further orders? Wasn't anyone down there capable of making decisions? He dashed off a note ordering them to stock up the upper camps as soon as possible. Dear Jack and Tony, the note began, I am very disappointed in you. When the message arrived in Camp 2, he did not make Jack Durrance or Tony Cromwell eager to rope up, step into the wind and snow, and risk his life for Fritz Weissner. In fact, just when Weissner needed his exhausted support crew the most, he had managed to demoralize them even further. As another storm rolled in on July 2nd, Durrance took refuge in his tent and complained in his diary. We move only as puppets, he wrote. It's definitely a one-man's trip. 3,000 feet above Camp 2, the puppet master was on the move. After waiting out of the storm for 3 days, Weissner, Kukuli, and Tendrup hoisted 40-pound loads on their backs and got ready to climb. Wolf stayed behind at Camp 5 to receive supplies from below and send the loads up in Weissner's wake. It was slow getting in fresh snow for the climbers. Weissner, who had led nearly the entire way up the mountain, once again broke trail. He sank deep with every step, laboring to breathe in the thin air. Finally, they found the 4 tent platforms of Camp 6. carved into the mountainside the year before by Houston and his team. They dropped their packs and pitched a tent, clinging to a steep slope with a tall rock buttress rising above them. The next morning, they scrambled through the treacherous rock slopes of the Black Pyramid. It was some of the most frightening climbing on the mountain, relentlessly steep and exposed. Weissner placed batons where he could and strung fixed ropes to help the team through the maze of rock and ice. A day later, Weissner had seen no sign of supplies from Camp Below. Had his note had no effect at all on the group at Camp 2? What were they going to do down there? He followed his tracks back to Camp 5 and found Wolf completely alone, running low on supplies. Always awkward climbing down, Wolf had been afraid to descend. But each day he had gone to the top of House's chimney and yelled on the cliffside, hoping to see Durrance and Cromwell leading a caravan of Sherpas up from below. Instead, there was only the howling wind and the stunning view of the glacier a mile down the mountain. Weissner stormed down the mountain to get the supply train moving again. When he appeared out of the blowing snow on the afternoon of July 9th, the miserable residents of Camp 2 hadn't seen their leader in nearly 3 weeks. Lo and behold, Fritz came forth from the hanging fogs of K2 alone aft, Durrance wrote. It was about 3:30 p.m. when he appeared, looking somewhat worn since I had last seen him 18 days ago. Leading a climb to 25,000 feet was enough to make anyone look worn, but Weissner was in good shape compared to his companions. Sheldon's feet had only gotten worse. He had retreated to base camp, and no one expected to see him on the mountain again. Durrance, Cromwell, and the Sherpas had gotten 2 loads halfway to Camp 4, but Cromwell had taken a bad fall and limped back to camp with a dull ache in his ribs. He was already planning their retreat. He had sent a note to Escole, the nearest village, ordering the porters to be at base camp by July 23rd, ready to haul their supply out. Weissner was livid with Cromwell for organizing the porters. He was in no mood to retreat and told them all in no uncertain terms. 2 days ago, he had powered his way to the top of the Abruzzi Ridge, 3,000 feet from the summit of K2. Not a single human being had ever stood at the top of an 8,000-meter peak, and they had the chance to be the first. But in order to do it, he needed support from below. Now that Durrance had his new boots, Weissner was counting on him to be part of the summit team. As for Cromwell, his job was to route the Sherpas and get them to stock the high camps. Weissner's speech got the team moving again, but it was a reluctant crew that dragged themselves out of the tents the next morning and prepared loads to carry up the mountain. Cromwell was sullen. They hadn't seen Weissner in 2.5 weeks, and now he appeared in camp demanding that they climb. And why was he so upset that they had summoned the porters for July 23rd? Weissner had agreed to that plan weeks ago. It didn't mean the advance party had to be ready to leave then. They merely had to get most of the gear to base camp to be hauled off the mountain. As for Durrance, for the first time in weeks, he felt motivated to climb. But the summit, he was already racked by headaches and sleepless nights at 19,000 feet. How could he drag himself another 9,000 feet higher? On July 11th, Durrance swallowed his doubts and set for Camp 5 with Weissner, Cromwell, and a team of Sherpas. Before they shouldered loads for the final push up the mountain, he sat down to describe the state of the expedition in his diary. Popshib Cromwell declares he is now used up and no good above 4, he wrote. George Sheldon is an invalid with frostbitten toes in base camp. Chap Kramer is still too weak to visit 1 and 2, so that Fritz, Dud, and I are the only ones left.